So when someone calls you racist, there are sadly only two responses that most people give. One is where you say, no, I'm not, and list off all the evidences of your non-racism. And of course, here you've now accepted this thing, racism, as an evil and are now talking about your partaking in it or your not partaking in it. The second response is only a little bit better, and that is to say, yes, I am a racist and proud of it. When someone calls someone or some act racist, notice they must define it in each use. Say what they mean by racist or how is that racist. So the word racist doesn't provide information for what is being described, it's just about adding a kind of stigma.
Mr. Rustin, can you clarify? Are you a racist? Mr. Rustin, are you a racist?
Brother Charles, tell me how what Sister Heather did was racist and how she needs to do more work. She needs to work on herself to avoid future racisms. Let's try this. If a Scientologist called you a suppressive, or a Muslim called you a kafir, or a communist called you a fascist or a counter-revolutionary, you wouldn't double down and say, damn right I'm those things, at least not seriously. Maybe you do it as kind of a joking thing, but you don't respect those things enough to do it seriously or to seriously consider yourself a suppressive. You may go, oh yeah, I'm a suppressive, out to get your thetans or whatever, just sort of as a joke, but not seriously. Now let's say you were in medieval Europe and someone called you a Satanist. Would you then go around and wave a pentagram flag and shout, Hail Satan, seriously? Maybe as a joke, although back then you probably wouldn't want to do that as a joke. But if you seriously think of yourself as a Satanist, you're kind of missing the whole point. If you say you oppose Christianity and then run around thinking you're a Satanist, well, you still bought into the Christian frame to some degree. And if you run around saying, I'm a racist, I'm a proud racist, and wave swastikas and Confederate battle flags, or you're wearing a white hood in the US today, you're missing the point. You've accepted the narrative but are just playing the role of the bad guy within that narrative. You're still using their symbols and thinking along their spectrum. Counter-revolutionary, heretic, apostate, suppressive, those terms only make sense in the context of a whole bunch of prior beliefs. Same with racism. If someone calls you a heretic, like seriously, what would your response be? Well, it should be either to mock them or to say that's not a real thing.
Are you or are you not a racist?
Well, you caught me at a bad time. I'm on my way out, so I'll have to ponder your deep and meaningful question when I come back.
Now, how can you...
Oh, excuse me.
Our producer suffered a cracked tooth as Rushton smiled and drove away.
If you're saying either, yeah, I'm a heretic and proud of it, or, oh no, I'm not a heretic, and let me tell you the 5 reasons why I'm not a heretic, then you've still bought into, at least some extent, the set of beliefs to where heretic is a meaningful term. For a long time, I thought wearing Nazi stuff or overtly racist quote-unquote imagery was really cringy and lame, and I couldn't explain why, but then I made that sort of connection to Satanism. Satanism is really cringy and really lame for the same reasons. Satanists aren't actually challenging Christians. In fact, they're helping Christians by creating the boogeyman that fits perfectly into their narrative, and they're doing this in a very second-hand embarrassment kind of way. You'd like to be able to tell a fundy that Satanists don't actually exist, but then they point to these clowns that imagine themselves to be Satanists and call themselves Satanists. I would like to tell anti-whites that Nazis literally don't exist, but then they point to these clowns who think they're Nazis and run around in the costumes or some sort of related costume that these anti-whites can point to, and then they can keep the whole thing going. Now, I use the term anti-white, an anti-white narrative, and someone just listening may think that's some sort of weird cult speak. Look, it's just a pejorative way to say the whole slavery, segregation, colonialism, white privilege narrative. If you believe that stuff to whatever degree, you believe parts of it, not other parts of it, that's the anti-white narrative. What else would you call it? What else could you call it? Now, one might just say, don't call it anything. It's just truth. It's just true facts, or just the truth about what happened. Well, whatever. You can go ahead and call it the true facts or whatever, but it is anti-white. and you can think of this anti-white narrative as being true, okay, but I'm not going to get into that here yet. I do some deep dives on those things in other places. One problem with Scientologists leaving Scientology is that they would oftentimes have feelings that they were somehow evil for leaving. That even though they knew consciously that all the doctrine was wrong, there was still a feeling that they were a bad person for being a suppressive. And I think this applies to whites who start to wake up from the anti-white narrative. That they know that the anti-white narrative, at least to some degree, is wrong, but they still feel that they're somehow a bad person for merely thinking in terms of their racial collective. That's why they have to go out and sort of puff up and say, white guilt, not me, white guilt, not me. That's to counteract the negative feelings of guilt that you get when you start to go up against a belief system that was imposed upon you at a very young age. Another thing that popped out at me was how many Scientologists leaving Scientology will, at first, say that they just thought something was wrong. They didn't know what it was and just had to leave. They are still Scientologists. They still believe in the teachings of L. Ron Hubbard, but they just started to see what the church was doing as being wrong, that there's something wrong going on here. They may not even be able to precisely put their finger on it, and they just gotta get out. And you see that with a lot of people who call themselves conservatives, not embracing full-on rejection of the racial narrative. They still believe in the colorblind society. They still believe in the multiracial project, but they're just starting to think that something's wrong, that these anti-whites are getting more and more aggressive, and they're starting to be kind of gross in what they're doing. It sounds funny to imagine a former Scientologist can still have a twinge of remorse or fear when called a suppressive, but how do you feel when called racist? They say it's like there's still a little Scientologist on their shoulder. Well, it's like there's a little anti-white cultist on my shoulder. One that still says, good boy, good job, when I point out that something is not racist or act in fairness between the races, but it's worlds apart from where it was 5 years ago. That little voice has gotten smaller and smaller over the years. What ex-Scientologists will say about other Scientologists is that they're mostly good people, that they're misguided with some real evil sons of bitches at the top. And that's basically how I feel about people who buy into the anti-white narrative still. They're not out to harm white people, they're not out to hate white people, but they just believe this as true and want to do good for the world in a general sense, whether they call themselves liberals, conservatives, or if they're one of those based values people who says, I'm fine with my race being replaced so long as my values are sustained, or some nonsense about the Constitution and Mamerka. And among Scientologists, there were those who would totally shun critics of the church, and those that were interested in critics of the church and would try to look at critics of Scientology. Conservatives who take a look at this white nationalism stuff. Basically, any white person who's not a white nationalist or white separatist or still believes in the multiracial project in the United States, I view them just as matter of fact, just as a brute fact of the world today, as belonging to a sort of anti-white cult.
This neighborhood is mostly completely insufferably white, but that's just the way things are here. It doesn't mean we're racist.
Theoretically, it doesn't have to be this way. In theory, you could support a multiracial project and not believe in a big backstory about how white people are the cause of all misfortune, but the reality of today is that 90+% chance, 90+% of the time, you believe in a big fat anti-white backstory if you believe in a multiracial program. But the fact that legally enforced racial separation was normal, so natural that it was done by default by the white settlers of the United States, and governments today are constantly having to battle racism and deal with racism coming back. When you look at the whole of human past history as being incorrect or somehow wrong, but the new beliefs that you have today are the natural ones, well, that's a sign that you're off on a dubious path. Basically, when white people were not indoctrinated with what I'm calling the anti-white narrative, they were overwhelmingly racial separatists and supported the expulsion of other races from their lands. Sometimes even other ethnicities within their race, but that's another story. But certainly other races would be expelled. Or if that couldn't be achieved, then they would support strict racial separation within their lands and absolutely laws against mixed marriages. And it was enough white people who thought this way that these issues were never up for debate until the anti-white narrative started to take hold. Say it's 80% of white people who are naturally white nationalists. That who, without the narrative, without the conditioning, they would be full-on white nationalists, what we conceive of today. It's going to be something like that because these issues were not even up for debate until very recently. So it has to be some sort of supermajority of whites are, in a state of nature, so to speak, white nationalists. It has to be some kind of supermajority to some degree or another. So it's going to be something like 80% because these issues weren't really even up for debate. Now, there are going to be those who will say that even without the indoctrination, they would have seen the wisdom and the truth of supporting a multiracial state and a multiracial society, that they're just so logical that they would have come to L. Ron Hubbard's positions on their own, even without any conditioning. That Islam is just so logical that they see the logic in the Marxist dialectic, that they would have come to these conclusions on their own, even in the absence of any political training. And I see all those things as being equally silly. And all this is done with a closed system of thought, but it's based on two things: approximate equality of all groups of men in the brain, and a belief in terrible oppression from the whites. A third pillar would be the extreme malleability of man, but that's sort of implied by the first two. So it's really those two. And you can see just how important the race and IQ stuff is when you understand the actual problem we face. Sure, the race and IQ, in a purely logical sense, does not lead to white nationalism, which is why you see many white nationalists saying that we should just drop all the race and IQ stuff altogether, including Richard Spencer. And I think they're not seeing this problem properly. The first and most important goal is to break the narrative. And the race and IQ stuff is important because it breaks that narrative. What's keeping them is the narrative, and it's critical to smash the narrative. Narrative. And I have to say that something like 90% of the white people that I know who embrace the race and IQ stuff, they become white nationalists eventually. Not right away. Sometimes it takes a year or two. But when that narrative is gone, they just kind of become who they are. When there's no longer these sorts of strictures in their own mind, they just go to where whites have always been through most of their history. And so when I say this stuff about how whites in the 1930s were all white nationalists as I am today, that's not just theory for me. That is a operating doctrine that works for me. It is a operationally validated thing for me. I don't think race differences in crime are very important, but I'll still talk about them from time to time because it's useful as a narrative breaker. And my philosophy is that once the narrative is broken, embracing full-on white nationalism is like crossing the street. You think it's a million miles away, but really it's just right across the way. And at some level, I think the hardcore anti-whites know this, the sort of Sea Org Antifa people. They know that it's the narrative that keeps the whites in, and without that narrative, some supermajority proportion, maybe 80%, maybe 90% of them are just going to full-on embrace white nationalism. At the very least, they're going to stop believing the narrative and they're going to start questioning all sorts of other things. And they're not going to view the multiracial project as a good in and of itself. That even if they're not white nationalists, they may start to become opposed to immigration because they become race indifferent, or at least race qua race indifferent. Now, the way this narrative is sort of built up, it's super effective, and it's a kind of bait and switch. It starts with stuff that you're told at elementary, middle, and high school. This is where you hear about slavery, segregation, colonialism, the supposed Native American genocide, and then depending on the school and depending on the level you're at, they'll tell you about white privilege. And all this stuff is told to you at an age before you can really think critically. Brain's not really finished developing until about age 24 on average. So really, nobody should be taught any of this stuff until they're about age 24. And they may also be taught things about scientific racism to sort of inoculate them against people talking about divergent evolution in humans. And then there are these universities and journals that operate as a giant confidence trick. And what this does is create the designated dispensers of truth. So You're told the racial narrative before college. Then you're told biological equality in college. And while you may not have very deep arguments yourself, you have a few sort of arguments that are given to you, but you don't really have a lot of deep understanding of this. Most people don't have a real deep defense of all this stuff. What they'll do is they'll believe that somewhere over the rainbow or somewhere off in the high tower, there's a bunch of super smart magic science men who have all the answers to all these things. That when I get up in their face and I say, well, actually, I don't think there really was a Native American genocide. Look at the mitochondrial DNA. That doesn't look like there was much of a population decline at all. Right, I'll say things like that, or I'll say things like, well, actually, segregation doesn't appear to have harmed blacks. I mean, if you control for regionality and control for the type of work, it looks like blacks were earning about what they're earning today, so it doesn't seem like segregation really impacted their income. I say things like this. They don't know how to respond to any of that, but they imagine that there's this magic science man over somewhere, and that if he were here, he could give me what for. Right? That there's these magic science man that could, if he showed up, could give me what for. And I actually felt this way for a long time. Remember, I was in this too at one point, and so I've internalized this too. Back in my early days when I was talking about race realism, I had a lingering fear that there were, in fact, some magic science men with some amazing next level ninja arguments that would absolutely destroy a pleb like me. Even though it's weird because I knew that this equality stuff, it was impossible. I mean, once you accept evolution, it's going to be impossible. And it just seemed retarded. And of course, I had never actually seen one of these great arguments against divergent evolution in humans, but it still dawned at me as a possibility that some faceless, nameless scientist just had all the truth bombs that would blow me out. And I'll have to tell you, when a PhD geneticist actually came onto the YouTubes and actually started arguing against me on the existence of race, that actually did a lot to allay that fear. Because all the superpositions, all the possibilities of what this magic science man could be were collapsed into a real person arguing against me, this person named Sophia Rune. This actually had a big impact on me and actually gave me a lot of confidence, because here I was actually talking to a geneticist, not a population geneticist, but some sort of general geneticist with a PhD, and she was making trash arguments, and I was able to respond to her arguments in a way that satisfied me. Now, how the audience viewed it, that's another story. Much of the audience just believed what she said because she had the funny hats, she had the credentials, the end. But for me, the potential nightmare was revealed to just not be, because the arguments she was making were no different from the classics I had heard up to that point. She didn't have anything new, and that really put a damper on any fear I had of magic science man.